Welcome to Digital Hammurabi, your guide to the ancient world, and a podcast devoted to sharing reliable, fact-based scholarship without the jargon of academia. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. I'm passionate about ancient history, and with 2 graduate degrees in the field, I am intimately familiar with the world of academic research. I'm here to help you avoid ancient aliens and, with nearly a decade of podcasting experience, help academic researchers explain their work in an entertaining and engaging way. Hello everybody, welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am joined by Dr. Mark Goodacre. Mark is Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University, North Carolina. He earned his MA, MPhil and DPhil from the University of Oxford. His research includes the Gospels, the Apocryphal New Testament and the Historical Jesus, and Mark is also the author of 4 books, including The Case Against Q, Studies in Mark and Priority, and The Synoptic Problem and Thomas and the Gospels, the case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptics. He's well known for creating web resources on New Testament and Christian origins, something we are heartily in favor of over at Digital Hammurabi. And he also has a podcast, the NT Pod. Mark has also acted as consultant for several TV and radio programs, including BBC HBO's The Passion and Finding Jesus on CNN. Mark is currently working on a book on John's knowledge of the Synoptic Gospels. I always trip over for that word. Mark, welcome to Digital Hammurabi, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Megan. It's lovely to be here.
It's going to be fun. Now, we're going to talk about the Synoptic Gospels, which is a word that has come up multiple times in my introduction there. And we're talking about it because you're actually going to be teaching an entire university-level course on the Synoptics through Bart Ehrman's Biblical Studies Academy. And this is a course aimed at non-academics, correct? It's not like you don't have to have any background knowledge in biblical studies or anything.
No, absolutely. And in fact, in many respects, it's similar to the teaching that I do at Duke anyway, because we don't ask for prerequisites in our classes. So lots of people that take a course with me on the Gospels, it not only is it their first course on the Bible, it's frequently their first course on anything to do with religious studies. So this is absolutely open to anybody. You just have to be able to read.
Fantastic. Now, it's 16 classes, and it's going to cover all kinds of fascinating ground, including investigations on why some of the stories in the Synoptic Gospels are so different, like the resurrection and the birth narratives, as well as a discussion on why the Synoptic Gospels were written, and the whys behind ancient texts are always very interesting to me personally and to my audience as well. Now, all of the course information, if this does sound interesting, including the individual lecture topics and pricing information, can be found at bartehrman.com/MML. That's MML for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you do sign up, then we have an affiliate link in the description. And if you would consider using that, I'd be very grateful. It's a really helpful way to support the channel financially without you actually having to spend some extra money. That is all the housekeeping I have. So we're going to dive into talking about the Synoptics, which is so interesting. So the first question I always ask my guests, Mark, is how you got into your field of study. So what prompted you to become a biblical scholar, and then why did you decide to focus on the Synoptics specifically?
It's a bit difficult because I can't really remember that well. All I can remember is being so absolutely fascinated by the New Testament and especially the Synoptic Gospels that I just felt I had to know more. Insofar as I can trace an origin, I can remember going to E.P. Sanders's lectures in Oxford. I was a student in Oxford, as you mentioned in your intro, and we had the most brilliant professor who later ended up at Duke University, where I am now, sadly no longer with us, E.P. Sanders. And his lectures on the Synoptic Gospels just completely blew my mind. Really, it was so exciting. I can probably put my finger on one specific thing, which is he introduced us to how to use a synopsis of the Gospels, how to actually compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I thought he was joking when he said that we needed to bring some colored pencils with us, but he wasn't. And I actually started coloring the synopsis. And then as soon as you start doing that, you see how similar they are and how different they are. And instantly you start saying, oh, I wonder what's happening there. I wonder why that's happening, and so on. So insofar as I can trace an origin, I think it's that, just being shown how interesting the topic is.
It's It's interesting sometimes how the passion of a professor or a colleague really
Hmm.
can spark something in your own brain that maybe was previously like a casual interest, but then someone
Hmm.
says something or presents it in a specific way, and you're like, actually, wow,
Hmm.
that's really, really fascinating. Now,
Hmm.
for those who don't know, what are the Synoptic Gospels and why are they called synoptic?
They're called synoptic. I mean, in some ways, it's a misleading term because when we talk about synopses in everyday life, we usually mean like a summary of something, and it's not that. It's basically the etymology is the syn bit, syn, it means together with, and the optic bit is obviously to do with the eyes, and it means Gospels that can be looked at together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be laid side by side in a synopsis in a way that it's much harder to do with John's Gospel. So that's really the origin of it. It's a really simple derivation. And it's because there are just so many similar passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Sometimes they agree, whole paragraphs at a time, and the order is really similar. And so it sort of it's so easy to do that comparison, that then it makes you say, well, hold on, what's happening here? That's the central mystery. That's the big puzzle. Why do they look so similar, but also why they're so different?
So, you just mentioned there are similarities, obviously, between these three Gospels. How significant are these similarities, and can they be explained just as a natural part of having different accounts of the same narrative?
Well, that's a great question. And I think instinctively, a lot of people expect the Synoptic Gospels to be like three different eyewitness takes on events. And people go, oh, it's not surprising that there's differences, because if you look at three different police reports of an accident, one person will look at it from one perspective, one from another. That kind of intuitive thing we have to get rid of, because in the Synoptic Gospels, we are not looking at three independent eyewitness stories of the same events. What we're looking at is some degree of copying is going on. And the reason for that is that the similarities are just too great. When you go on for whole sentences at a time, that means that someone is copying from somebody else. So that's really the fundamental thing. This is a literary problem. I mean, obviously, there are other things involved. There would have been oral tradition and so on and so on and so on. But the key thing is that there's a literary relationship.
Do you have the same sections copied across all three Gospels, or are there different segments like Mark and Luke share this particular and Mark and Matthew share something else?
Sure. I mean, the fun is when you start digging down into it, you get loads of stuff that's shared between all three. So you get loads of stuff in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we call that triple tradition. You get a whole bunch of stuff that just Matthew and Luke share, and that we call double tradition. You see, quite simple stuff. And then and then you get a bunch of stuff that's only in Matthew and a bunch of stuff that's only in Luke. And we tend to just call that M or L, for obvious reasons. So you've got those fundamental four types of material. And then there's also some things which are just in Matthew and Mark, and there's some stuff which is just in Mark and Luke, and so on. And so, yes, a lot of it is about, okay, why doesn't Luke have this bit? And why does Matthew have this bit? And why doesn't Mark have this bit? And that's part of the puzzle. You've got to say, why is it that certain things are present? And why is it that certain things are absent?
So, one way that some of the similarities between Matthew and Luke are explained often by biblical scholars is through something called Q. Can you
Mm-hmm.
give a brief explanation of what that is?
Sure. Well, the thing is, because Matthew and Luke have got a whole bunch of verses, people usually say about 200 verses that are not found in Mark, then clearly there's got to be, they've got to come from somewhere. And really, there's three logical explanations. One is that Matthew copied off Luke, one is that Luke copied off Matthew, and the other one is that neither of them knew each other and they both knew something else that we haven't got. Now, that's where Q comes in, because if neither Matthew's copying from Luke or Luke from Matthew, then they've got to have got it from a hypothetical document. So we've invented this. I say we, I actually don't believe in it, but scholars have invented this idea of Q. And Q simply stands for Quelle, which is the German word for source. So it's basically a way of saying that they were dependent on this kind of source. And to be clear, even though people know, I mean, even in your intro, you said that one of my books is called The Case Against Q. So it's no spoiler that I don't believe in Q. But having said that, I do think it's a fascinating and compelling theory, and I understand why people are excited by it.
Why do you think that Q or the idea of Q is problematic?
Well, for a very simple reason, I think that Luke copied from Matthew. I think that you can actually see in Luke's gospel, it just makes great sense of the way that Luke is constructed, because there's a whole lot of things that Luke does just in terms of the way that he structures his gospel, even, that make much better sense to me if he knows Matthew's gospel rather than this hypothetical text, because the hypothetical text has just got a bunch of Jesus' sayings in it mainly. But if Luke knows the whole of Matthew's gospel, then it's no surprise that Luke suddenly, like Matthew, adds some birth narratives, which nobody else is doing in antiquity. Mark doesn't do it, John doesn't do it, and so on. And they both add resurrection appearances at the end. And I also feel that you can see in a bunch of the agreements between Matthew and Luke what scholars like to term Matthew's redactional fingerprints, that there are certain ways that Matthew says things. Like, he'll say things like weeping and gnashing of teeth 5 times in the gospel, and Luke takes it over once. So you get these little Mattheanisms that pop up. So in my reading of it, Q is less plausible than Luke knowing Matthew. And Luke knowing Matthew means that you don't have to hypothesize an entity that we don't have any other evidence for.
And you do have an entire class in this lecture series on Q, so I suspect that's just a very briefest of teasers for those who are interested.
Yeah. Now, I'm tempted to do. So I'm tempted to make it like 10 classes, because I love doing that. But I'll suppress that geek in me, and we'll do the one. Yeah.
Now, what are some common misconceptions about the Synoptic Gospels that you encounter when you talk to non-academics?
I think one of the key ones is the idea that if they're not basically different versions of the same story that's been witnessed independently, like I was saying earlier on, like in the kind of police reports, that people think, well, maybe they just come from oral tradition. Maybe you've got this whole bank of oral tradition, and the different gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just pulled from that oral tradition, which means that then they sometimes agree and sometimes disagree. And the reason why I think that's compelling to people is that the ancients talked to one another, and they must have told stories about Jesus. We know that they told stories about Jesus because some of them pop up in other early Christian literature. So we know they were telling stories about Jesus. The question is that a sufficient explanation? And it's not. Yes, I think oral tradition may have been involved in the origins of the Gospels, though it gets massively overstated and overestimated. But I think it's that the sheer literary similarity between Matthew and Mark, Mark and Luke, and Matthew and Luke really means that an oral tradition explanation won't be enough. So I think that's probably the number one sort of misconception, I would say.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Those are all the questions I have. Is there anything you want to add that you think people should know about the course?
I suppose I would just say that expect to do a little bit of work. The idea is that, yes, it will be me, chatting away about the Synoptic Gospels, but I think people will get the most from it if they get open the Gospels in front of them. That's the main thing. Read the Gospels themselves, and the more you dig into the details, those similarities and differences I was talking about, the more I think people will get out of the course. So I think that's one thing that I would say. Just like we always say to our students, expect to do some reading.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a delight talking to you.
It's a pleasure.
And again, audience, if you are interested, there are more details over at bartehrman.com/MML. That's MML for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We'll see you next time. You have been listening to Digital Hammurabi, your guide to the ancient world. Thank you for joining us, and if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like, leave a comment or review, and definitely share it with your friends. Every little bit helps get our work to an audience that didn't know they needed us. Until next time, avoid the aliens and always ask, how do you know that?